Some places are abandoned for a reason. Others are abandoned because the truth inside them is waiting for the right soul to return. Ethan Walker first saw the cave house on a rainy Thursday afternoon deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. It was not listed through a realtor. It was not advertised online. In fact, most people in the nearby town seemed surprised that anyone even knew it existed. The property sat hidden among steep cliffs and towering pine trees nearly 6 miles from the nearest paved road. Moss covered the stone walls. Thick vines crawled over the entrance. Decades of weather had stained the rock with dark streaks that made the entire structure seem older than the mountain itself. Yet somehow it still stood, quiet, watching, waiting. Ethan parked his pickup truck beside a narrow dirt trail and stepped out into the cool mountain air. At 52 years old, the retired Marine had seen enough of life to know that appearances often lied. He had purchased the property 3 days earlier for $300 after discovering it buried inside a county auction file. Most people would have assumed it was worthless. Ethan saw something different. Solitude. A fresh start. Maybe even a place where the noise of the past could finally grow quiet. Beside him, Ranger jumped down from the passenger seat. The 7-year-old German shepherd landed softly on the damp ground and immediately lifted his nose toward the wind. Ethan smiled. "What do you think, buddy?" Ranger did not respond the way he normally would. He did not explore. He did not run ahead. He simply stared. His amber eyes locked onto the cave house entrance. His ears stood high. His body became completely still. Ethan noticed it immediately. Ranger was many things. Curious, loyal, intelligent, but he was never nervous. Yet something about the cave house had captured the dog's full attention. The entrance opened directly into the mountainside. Massive stone blocks framed the doorway, blending so naturally into the cliff that the structure appeared carved from the earth itself. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and backpack before walking inside. Cool air greeted him instantly. The scent of damp, stone and old wood filled the darkness. Sunlight from the entrance stretched across the floor in long golden bands. Dust floated through the beams like tiny drifting stars. The main chamber was larger than expected. A stone fireplace occupied one wall. Shelves carved directly into the rock lined another. Someone had once lived here. Not briefly. For years. Ethan moved deeper inside. Ranger followed close behind. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly somewhere in the distance. Outside, wind whispered through the pine trees. Inside, silence seemed to cling to every surface. Then Ranger stopped. Abruptly. Completely. Ethan turned. The German shepherd stood facing a stone wall near the back of the cave house. Not moving. Not blinking. Just staring. "Ranger," Ethan called softly. The dog ignored him. He approached the wall slowly and lowered his head. His nose hovered inches from the stone. Then he sat down. Ethan walked over and examined the wall. At first it looked ordinary. Rough stone. Age-darkened rock. Nothing unusual. Yet Ranger refused to leave. Minutes passed. The dog remained there, watching, listening, waiting. As evening settled outside, Ethan unpacked supplies and prepared to spend his first night in the cave house. The mystery could wait until morning. Or so he thought. Because several hours later, long after darkness swallowed the mountains and the fire burned low, Ethan woke to an unfamiliar sound. Not from outside. Not from the forest. From behind that very wall. He listened carefully. Once. Then again. A faint scratching noise echoed through the stone. Ranger was already awake, standing beside the wall, staring at something Ethan could not yet see. And when the firelight flickered across the rock, it briefly revealed a faded handprint painted directly onto the stone surface. Morning arrived slowly inside the cave house. Pale sunlight filtered through the entrance and stretched across the stone floor in narrow bands of gold. Ethan had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the faded handprint that appeared on the wall during the night. The image lingered in his thoughts like a half-forgotten memory. Ranger was already awake. The German shepherd sat exactly where Ethan had last seen him, facing the wall, watching, waiting. The strange scratching sound had stopped hours earlier, but the dog refused to leave his position. Ethan stood and approached the stone surface once more. Up close, the handprint appeared older than he originally thought. The paint had faded into the rock over decades. Dust and moisture had nearly erased it entirely. Yet someone had deliberately placed it there. Not randomly. Purposefully. Ranger stepped forward and pressed his nose against the stone. Ethan crouched beside him. The wall seemed solid enough. Rough rock, natural formations, nothing obvious. Then Ranger moved slightly to the left and began sniffing a narrow section near the edge of the chamber. Ethan followed. There, almost invisible beneath layers of dirt and mineral stains, he noticed a thin vertical crack running through the stone. It was too straight to be natural. Too clean. His pulse quickened. "You found something, did you not?" Ranger's ears lifted. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and examined the crack more closely. The beam revealed faint tool marks hidden beneath years of erosion. Someone had worked on this wall. The realization sent a chill through him. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees. Inside, the cave remained silent except for the occasional drip of water echoing from somewhere deep within the mountain. Ethan spent most of the morning cleaning the area around the crack. Dust filled the air. Small fragments of stone scattered across the floor. Slowly, more details emerged. What appeared to be solid rock was actually a concealed stone panel carefully blended into the surrounding wall. Ranger never left his side. By afternoon, Ethan located a small depression near the painted handprint. It looked like part of a hidden mechanism. He pressed against it. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. Frustrated, he sat back and wiped sweat from his forehead. Ranger suddenly stood. Without warning, the dog placed one paw directly against the lower section of the wall. A dull click echoed through the chamber. Ethan froze. The sound was unmistakable. Slowly, a small section of stone shifted inward. Dust drifted from the seams. Ranger stepped backward while Ethan carefully pulled the hidden panel open. Cool air escaped from the darkness beyond. Behind the wall was a narrow cavity carved directly into the mountain. Not large enough for a person, just large enough to conceal something valuable. Ethan aimed his flashlight inside. The beam illuminated a weathered steel box resting on a stone shelf. His heart began to race. The box looked old, very old. Rust covered its edges. A heavy latch secured the front. Whoever placed it there clearly never intended casual visitors to find it. Ranger sat beside the opening, watching quietly. Ethan reached inside and carefully lifted the box free. It felt surprisingly heavy. Years of dust coated its surface. He carried it to a nearby table carved from stone and stared at it for several seconds. The cave seemed quieter than ever. Even the wind outside appeared to fade. Slowly, Ethan released the latch. The metal groaned softly. The lid opened. Inside rested a stack of yellowed papers, several black and white photographs, and a leather journal whose cover contained no name. Ethan lifted the journal first. The leather felt worn smooth by countless hands. He opened to the first page. Most of the writing remained intact. Yet one detail immediately stood out. Every name had been carefully removed. Entire lines were blacked out. Every identity erased. Except for one sentence written across the top of the page. Ethan read it once. Then again. The words sent a chill through the cave. They buried the wrong man. Ethan stared at the sentence for a long moment while silence settled across the cave house. They buried the wrong man. The words seemed impossible. Yet there they were, written in dark ink across yellowed paper hidden behind a stone wall deep inside a mountain. Ranger sat beside the table, his amber eyes fixed on the journal. The German shepherd had not relaxed since the discovery. It was as if he sensed there was more waiting beneath the surface. Outside, afternoon sunlight faded behind the cliffs surrounding the property. Shadows slowly crept across the cave floor. Ethan turned the page. More writing appeared beneath the blacked-out names. Entire paragraphs remained readable except for identities that had been deliberately erased. Whoever owned the journal had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal specific people. The first entry described a funeral attended by nearly the entire town decades earlier. According to the writer, everyone believed a certain man had died. Yet the journal insisted the grave contained someone else entirely. Ethan frowned. The story made little sense. Why would anyone fake a burial? Why erase every name afterward? Ranger suddenly stood and approached the photographs found inside the steel box. Ethan picked up the top image. It showed a group of people standing in front of a wooden church sometime in the past. Men wore old-fashioned jackets. Women stood beside them smiling for the camera. Yet one detail immediately caught his attention. Every face had been scratched out except one. Near the edge of the photograph stood a tall man wearing a sheriff's badge. His face remained untouched. Ethan flipped the photograph over. On the back, a single word had been written in faded pencil. Betrayal. A chill moved through him. He examined the remaining photographs. The pattern repeated. Faces scratched away. Names removed. Clues hidden in plain sight. One image showed a mountain cabin. Another showed a small cemetery. A third captured a river crossing surrounded by pine trees. On the back of each photo appeared brief notes. Warnings. Reminders. Pieces of a puzzle. The cave grew darker as evening approached. Ethan lit a lantern and continued reading. Several journal entries described meetings held in secret. The writer repeatedly mentioned fear. Not fear of strangers. Fear of someone trusted. Someone close. The realization changed everything. This was not a story about a man hiding from enemies. This was a story about a man betrayed by friends. Ranger suddenly moved toward the rear corner of the cave house. His nails clicked softly against the stone floor. Ethan looked up. The dog was staring at a narrow shelf carved directly into the rock wall. He walked over and discovered something he had missed earlier. Resting beneath a layer of dust sat a small wooden frame. Inside was a faded photograph protected behind cracked glass. Ethan carefully lifted it. The image showed the same sheriff from the earlier photograph, standing beside another man. Unlike the others, neither face had been damaged. Both appeared young. Both were smiling. The back contained another handwritten note. Best friends until the truth came. Ethan's pulse quickened. The sheriff. The betrayal. The false grave. The erased identities. Slowly, a larger story began forming. One involving friendship, deception, and a secret hidden for generations. Then Ethan noticed something else tucked behind the photograph. A folded piece of paper. He carefully opened it. Inside was a rough map of the nearby area. Most of it looked familiar. The mountains, the river, the town. But one location had been marked with a dark circle. At the bottom, a message had been written in hurried handwriting. If you want proof, visit the grave. Ranger stood beside him, ears raised toward the fading light beyond the cave entrance. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the pines. And for the first time, Ethan realized the next clue was not hidden inside the cave house at all. It was waiting in a cemetery where the wrong man had supposedly been buried. The cemetery sat on a lonely hillside overlooking the valley. Ethan reached it shortly after sunrise the following morning. Thin mist drifted across the rows of weathered headstones, while pale golden light spilled over the surrounding mountains. The place felt forgotten, not abandoned, but untouched by time. Ranger walked ahead along the narrow gravel path, his ears alert and his nose constantly testing the cool morning air. The map from the cave house led directly to this location. A dark circle had marked one grave among hundreds. Ethan carried the folded paper inside his jacket pocket as he searched the aging markers one by one. Many names had faded beyond recognition. Some stones leaned at odd angles. Others had cracked beneath decades of harsh winters. Silence surrounded the hill except for distant birdsong and the whisper of wind moving through tall grass. Then Ranger stopped. The German shepherd stood beside a large headstone near the edge of the cemetery. Ethan approached slowly. The marker appeared older than most. Moss covered sections of the carved letters. Carefully brushing away dirt, Ethan revealed the inscription beneath. The name meant nothing to him, yet the date immediately caught his attention. It matched the funeral described in the journal almost exactly. Ranger sniffed around the base of the monument. His posture changed. Focused. Intent. The same look he wore whenever he discovered something important. Ethan knelt beside him. At first he noticed nothing unusual. Then sunlight struck a small object partially buried in the soil near the back of the grave. He carefully reached down and pulled it free. A tarnished metal badge rested in his hand. Dirt clung to its surface. Time had worn away much of the detail. Yet one thing remained visible. A sheriff's star. Ethan's pulse quickened. The same sheriff whose face remained untouched in the photographs. The same sheriff connected to the word betrayal. Ranger nudged the ground again. Ethan examined the area more closely. Beneath layers of grass and fallen leaves he discovered a second object. A small brass plate no larger than a postcard. It appeared to have broken away from something years earlier. Faint engraving remained visible across the surface. He cleaned it gently with a handkerchief. Several words emerged. Property of the county sheriff's office. Below that, a partially visible name. Only the first few letters remained readable. Enough to confirm what Ethan already suspected. The badge belonged to the sheriff from the photographs. A chill ran through him. Why would a sheriff's badge be hidden behind a grave connected to a false burial? The answer felt close now, almost within reach. Yet another mystery appeared moments later. Rangers suddenly began pawing gently near a patch of earth several feet from the headstone. Not digging frantically, just enough to draw attention. Ethan moved closer and discovered a small stone marker nearly hidden beneath overgrown grass. Unlike the larger headstone, this marker carried no name, no date, no inscription, nothing except a symbol carved into the center. Ethan stared in disbelief. It was the exact same handprint he had seen painted on the wall inside the cave house. The symbol connected everything. The cave, the journal, the photographs, the grave. Someone had deliberately left a trail. Ranger sat beside the marker while Ethan examined the carving. Then he noticed something else. Tucked into a crack beneath the stone rested a small cloth pouch protected from the weather. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a folded newspaper clipping yellowed with age. The headline had faded, but one sentence remained legible. Local hero dies during search operation. Ethan's eyes widened. Hero, not criminal, not fugitive. Hero. The entire story was beginning to shift. And as he unfolded the rest of the clipping, a photograph slipped free and landed in the grass. It showed the sheriff standing beside the man everyone believed was buried here. On the back was a single handwritten sentence. He was never the villain. He was the witness. The newspaper clipping remained in Ethan's hands long after the morning sun climbed above the mountains. He stood beside the nameless marker while Ranger sat quietly nearby, his amber eyes following every movement. The sentence written behind the photograph echoed through Ethan's thoughts. He was never the villain. He was the witness. Everything he had uncovered so far pointed in the same direction. The town believed one story. The evidence hidden across the cave house, cemetery, and journal suggested something entirely different. Ethan carefully folded the clipping and placed it inside his jacket. Then he unfolded the map again. This time he noticed a detail he had missed before. Near the edge of the paper, beyond the cemetery and several miles north of the river, someone had drawn a small cabin. Next to it appeared the same handprint symbol. Ranger immediately became alert when Ethan pointed toward it. The German shepherd rose to his feet and stared toward the distant mountains. It was enough. Ethan knew where they were going next. By afternoon, the two of them were deep inside the forest. Pine trees stretched endlessly across the slopes. Sunlight filtered through the branches and shifting. Patterns of gold and shadow. The trail grew narrower with every mile. Eventually, it disappeared altogether. Yet Ranger continued forward with confidence. Several times he paused to check behind him before leading Ethan deeper into the wilderness. The air smelled of pine sap, damp earth, and wild grass warmed by the sun. Hours later, the cabin appeared between the trees. Small, weathered, nearly invisible beneath decades of overgrowth. Ethan stopped. The structure looked abandoned, but not ruined. Someone had cared for it once. A narrow porch faced the valley below. Broken shutters hung beside dusty windows. Wind moved softly through the surrounding forest. Ranger approached first. His ears stood high. His nose tested the air. Ethan climbed the porch steps carefully and pushed open the door. The hinges groaned softly. Sunlight spilled into a single-room cabin frozen in time. Dust covered the furniture. A cast-iron stove sat in one corner. Shelves lined the walls. Yet unlike the cave house, this place felt personal. Lived in. On the far wall hung a large photograph. Ethan moved closer. His breath caught. The image showed the same man from the cemetery photograph, standing beside the sheriff. Both appeared younger. Both were smiling. Best friends. At least once. Ranger wandered toward a wooden desk near the window. He sniffed along its surface before nudging a drawer with his nose. Ethan opened it. Inside rested dozens of letters bundled together with faded twine. The handwriting matched the journal from the cave house. Carefully, he untied the bundle and began reading. The first few letters revealed the truth he had been chasing. The witness had uncovered evidence exposing corruption involving several powerful people in town. The sheriff initially promised to help. They worked together, trusted each other. Then everything changed. One letter described a meeting. Another described threats. A third ended abruptly with a single sentence. I never expected betrayal from my closest friend. Ethan slowly lowered the page. The room seemed smaller suddenly. He understood now. The sheriff was not hunting the witness. The sheriff had once stood beside him. Somewhere along the way, loyalty gave way to fear. Ranger suddenly moved toward the stone fireplace. He sat down and stared at the wall behind it. Ethan recognized that look immediately. The same look he had seen in the cave house. Another clue. Another hidden secret. He crossed the room and examined the stones. There, tucked between two loose rocks, rested a folded piece of paper protected inside a tin sleeve. Ethan carefully opened it. Inside was a map. Not of the mountains. Not of the town. A map leading back to the cave house itself. At the bottom, one message had been written in hurried ink. The proof is still hidden where it all began. The drive back to the cave house felt different. Not because the road had changed, but because Ethan now understood that every clue, every photograph, every hidden message had been leading him toward a single truth. The witness had trusted someone. That trust had been broken. And somehow the final proof remained hidden inside the mountain itself. Ranger sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the forest pass beyond the window. The German shepherd seemed unusually calm, as though he already knew the next piece of the mystery was close. Evening shadows stretched across the valley by the time they arrived. The cave house stood exactly as they had left it. Stone walls blended into the cliff face. Vines swayed gently in the cooling breeze. The entrance appeared dark beneath the fading sunlight. Yet Ethan no longer saw an abandoned shelter. He saw a carefully constructed vault designed to protect a secret for generations. The moment they stepped inside, Ranger became alert. His ears rose. His gaze locked onto the rear chamber where the hidden steel box had been discovered. Ethan followed him through the cave. Lantern light flickered against the walls while distant water dripped somewhere deep inside the mountain. The familiar scent of stone and earth surrounded them. Ranger ignored the concealed compartment this time. Instead, he moved directly toward the painted handprint. The faded symbol remained visible against the rock. Ethan studied it carefully. For the first time, he noticed something unusual. The fingers were not pointing upward. They angled slightly to one side, almost like an arrow. He stepped closer. The handprint pointed directly toward a narrow section of stone beside the original hiding place. His pulse quickened. Ranger pressed his nose against the wall and immediately sat down. The same signal he always gave when he found something important. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and examined the area inch by inch. Most of the stone appeared natural. Then the beam caught a small metal object embedded within a crack. It looked like the head of an old bolt. Carefully brushing away dirt, he exposed a circular iron ring hidden beneath layers of dust. The ring blended perfectly into the rock. No wonder he had missed it before. He wrapped his fingers around the metal and pulled. At first nothing happened. Then a low grinding sound echoed through the chamber. Dust drifted from above. Ranger stepped backward. Slowly, part of the wall shifted outward. Cool air escaped from the darkness beyond. Another hidden compartment. Smaller than the first. Older. Ethan aimed the flashlight inside. Resting on a stone shelf was a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Nothing else. No photographs. No journals. Just a single box waiting in silence. He lifted it carefully. The wood felt surprisingly well preserved despite the decades. Back at the table, he removed the cloth and examined the lid. Carved into the surface were two words. Final evidence. Ethan stared for several seconds before opening it. Inside rested a stack of official documents bound together with twine. Several carried county seals. Others bore signatures. As he scanned the first pages, the entire story finally began making sense. Land records. Financial transactions. Property transfers. The witness had uncovered proof that influential men secretly stole land from local families decades earlier. The sheriff had originally helped gather evidence. Then pressure came. Threats followed. Somewhere along the way, he chose self-preservation over truth. Ethan turned another page. A handwritten statement appeared near the bottom. The witness explained everything. He never vanished because he was guilty. He vanished because revealing the evidence would have endangered innocent people he loved. The cave grew silent around him. Ranger rested beside the table. Ethan continued reading until one final document slipped free from the stack. Unlike the others, it contained a photograph attached to the front. The moment he saw it, he froze. It showed the witness standing beside a young girl. On the back, written in careful handwriting, were 7 words. If she is alive, tell her everything. The photograph remained on the table long after midnight. Ethan sat beside the lantern while Ranger rested near the fireplace, the warm glow of the flame reflecting softly across the stone walls. Outside, wind moved through the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. Inside the cave house, the mystery felt closer than ever. The young girl in the photograph could not have been older than 8 years old. She stood beside the witness with one hand wrapped around his arm. Both were smiling. Neither appeared aware that history would eventually bury their names beneath decades of silence. Ethan carefully turned the photograph over again. The message remained unchanged. If she is alive, tell her everything. The request felt less like a note and more like a final promise waiting to be fulfilled. Ranger lifted his head as Ethan opened the remaining documents. Most contained legal records and correspondence. Yet near the bottom of the stack he discovered a folded letter sealed inside a weathered envelope. Unlike the others, this one had never been opened. Across the front, written in neat handwriting, were 3 simple words. For my family. Ethan hesitated before breaking the seal. The paper inside crackled softly with age. The witness explained why he disappeared. Not to escape responsibility. Not to avoid justice. He left because powerful people wanted the evidence hidden forever. Remaining visible would have placed his loved ones directly in danger. He believed vanishing was the only way to keep them safe. The letter ended with an apology to the young girl. A daughter. The realization settled heavily across the room. The witness had sacrificed his own life as he knew it to protect hers. Ethan folded the letter carefully and looked back. At the photograph. Somewhere, if fate had been kind, that little girl might still be alive. The next morning he drove into town. Ranger accompanied him, as always. The county records office occupied an aging brick building near the courthouse square. Most residents barely noticed them enter. Ethan spent hours reviewing old public records. Many files had been archived decades earlier. Some had faded with time. Others contained gaps that raised more questions than answers. Yet slowly a trail emerged. The witness's daughter had eventually left the area. Her name changed after marriage. New addresses appeared. New records followed. Ethan copied every detail he could find. By late afternoon, one address stood out. A small lakeside community nearly 200 miles away. The records suggested she still lived there. Ethan stared at the page for several moments. After everything the witness had endured, after decades of silence and misunderstanding, the possibility felt almost unbelievable. Ranger nudged his hand gently, as if encouraging him forward. The drive took most of the following day. Mountains gave way to rolling hills. Forests opened into farmland. By sunset they reached the lakeside town. The address led to a modest white house overlooking calm water. Flower gardens surrounded the porch. Wind chimes swayed gently beneath the eaves. Nothing about the place suggested wealth or importance. It simply felt like home. Ethan parked across the street and sat quietly for a moment. Through the front window, he could see an elderly woman arranging books on a shelf. Gray hair, kind posture, peaceful movements. Ranger watched the house with unusual focus. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped from the truck. The path to the porch seemed longer than it should have. Every answer he carried had been hidden for decades. Every truth waited behind a single door. He knocked softly. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened. The woman looked at Ethan first, then at Ranger. Her expression remained polite but curious. Ethan was about to introduce himself when Ranger suddenly froze. His ears lifted, his eyes fixed on something hanging beside the doorway. Ethan turned and felt his heart skip. Framed beneath the porch light was the same photograph from the cave house. The witness and the little girl. And the woman standing before him was that little girl grown old. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The elderly woman simply stared at Ethan, then at Ranger, then back at the photograph hanging beside her front door. Evening sunlight reflected softly across the lake behind her house, painting the porch in warm shades of gold and amber. Ranger remained perfectly still. The German shepherd's gaze never left the photograph. It was as though he understood this moment mattered. Finally, the woman smiled politely. "Can I help you?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I think I have something that belongs to your family." The words seemed to catch her off guard. Curiosity replaced caution. She invited them inside. The home felt warm and welcoming. Books lined the walls. Family photographs rested on shelves and tables. A grandfather clock ticked softly near the living room window. Ranger followed quietly as Ethan sat across from the woman at a small wooden table overlooking the lake. Her name was Eleanor Brooks. As they talked, Ethan carefully placed the photograph from the cave house onto the table. The moment Eleanor saw it, her expression changed completely. Her eyes widened. Her hand rose slowly to her mouth. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. Ethan explained everything. The cave house, the hidden room, the journal, the cemetery, the mountain cabin, the letters. He left nothing out. Eleanor listened without interruption. Several times tears appeared in her eyes, but she never looked away. When Ethan finally showed her the unopened family letter, she hesitated before touching it. Her hands trembled slightly. For more than 60 years, she had lived with unanswered questions. She had been told her father died a hero. Later she heard rumors claiming he had disappeared. Others suggested he had abandoned his family. Over time, she stopped searching for answers because every version of the story contradicted the one before it. Yet now the truth sat directly in front of her. Carefully, she unfolded the letter and began reading. Silence filled the room. Outside, gentle waves moved across the lake. Inside, only the sound of turning paper could be heard. Ranger quietly rested beside Eleanor's chair. At one point, she reached down and placed her hand on his head without even realizing it. The simple gesture seemed to steady her. When she finished reading, tears rolled down her cheeks. Not tears of grief, tears of relief. Her father had never abandoned her. Every sacrifice, every secret, every year spent hiding had been motivated by love. Ethan watched quietly while she gathered herself. Eventually, Eleanor stood and walked toward a bookshelf near the fireplace. From the top shelf, she retrieved a small wooden box. Dust covered the lid. She carried it back to the table and opened it. Inside rested dozens of items she had preserved throughout her life. Birthday cards, old photographs, school drawings. At the bottom sat a faded envelope addressed in handwriting Ethan immediately recognized from the cave house documents. Eleanor smiled sadly. "This arrived after he disappeared," she said. "I never understood why there was no return address." Inside the envelope was a single page. Ethan read it carefully. The witness promised he would someday explain everything. He wrote that the truth was hidden in a place built from stone where memories could survive longer than people. Ethan and Eleanor exchanged a glance. Both knew exactly what he meant. The cave house had never been chosen by accident. It was designed to preserve evidence until the right person found it. Then Eleanor noticed something tucked inside the back of the envelope. A small photograph she had never seen before. The image showed her father standing beside an older woman. On the back appeared a handwritten note. "Find Margaret. She knows the final truth." The photograph rested on Eleanor's kitchen table long after the sun disappeared beyond the lake. Ethan studied the image carefully. The older woman standing beside Eleanor's father appeared confident and composed. Gray hair framed a face marked by experience rather than age. Behind them stood a stone building Ethan did not recognize. The handwritten message on the back remained frustratingly brief. "Find Margaret. She knows the final truth." Ranger lay quietly beneath the table, though his ears lifted every time the name was mentioned. Eleanor searched through her memories. At first she could not place the woman. Then slowly something surfaced. A story from childhood. A visitor who occasionally arrived during difficult years after her father's disappearance. Someone who always brought books. Someone who never answered questions directly. Margaret Hayes. The name felt familiar the moment she spoke it aloud. Ethan immediately wrote it down. The next morning they began searching public records together. The trail was surprisingly short. Margaret Hayes had once worked as a librarian in a small mountain town less than 80 miles from the cave house. More surprising was the fact that she was still alive, 91 years old, living in an assisted care residence near the same town where the entire mystery began. By midday, Ethan and Ranger were back on the road. Eleanor insisted on joining them. For the first time in decades, she was not chasing rumors. She was following evidence left behind by her father himself. The drive carried them through valleys painted with autumn colors. Golden aspens covered the hillsides. Rivers reflected bright blue skies. Yet beneath the beauty, tension quietly grew. Each answer seemed to uncover another layer of hidden history. Late that afternoon, they arrived at the residence. Margaret Hayes sat near a large window overlooking a garden filled with wildflowers. Though age had softened her features, her eyes remained sharp and observant. When she noticed the photograph in Eleanor's hands, her expression changed immediately. She recognized it before anyone spoke. For a long moment, she simply stared. Then she smiled sadly. I wondered if this day would ever come. Ethan felt a chill. Margaret invited them to sit. Ranger settled beside her chair as though they had known each other for years. The old woman gently rested one hand on the German shepherd's head. Your father loved dogs, she told Eleanor softly. He trusted them more than most people. The conversation lasted for hours. Piece by piece, Margaret revealed what happened after the witness disappeared. He never left the region entirely. Instead, he moved between safe locations while quietly protecting copies of the evidence. The cave house was only one of several hiding places. The mountain cabin was another. Margaret herself had helped preserve documents because she believed the truth deserved a future. Eleanor listened in silence. Tears occasionally appeared, but she never interrupted. Then Margaret revealed something none of them expected. The witness and the sheriff eventually met one final time. Not as enemies, not as friends, as two men carrying the weight of impossible choices. According to Margaret, the sheriff spent the rest of his life regretting what happened. He never exposed the corruption, but he secretly helped protect the evidence from destruction. Ethan sat back in disbelief. The story was more complicated than betrayal alone. It was fear, regret, loyalty, weakness, humanity. Before they left, Margaret opened a small cedar chest beside her chair. Inside rested a sealed envelope addressed to whoever finally uncovered the truth. The paper looked remarkably well preserved. Across the front appeared familiar handwriting. The witness had written it himself. Margaret carefully placed the envelope into Eleanor's hands. Her voice trembled slightly. Everything you need is inside. Eleanor stared at the seal. Ethan could see emotion building behind her eyes. Decades of uncertainty had led to this single moment. Slowly, she turned the envelope over. On the back, beneath a faded handprint symbol, 7 words had been written in careful ink. Open this only when forgiveness becomes possible. The envelope remained unopened throughout the drive back. Eleanor held it carefully in her lap, while evening sunlight painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Ranger rested quietly in the back seat, occasionally lifting his head to watch the passing landscape. Ethan focused on the road, but his thoughts never strayed far from the letter. Decades of secrets had led to this moment. Every hidden compartment, every photograph, every clue left behind by a man determined to preserve the truth. Yet none of them rushed to break the seal. Some things demanded patience. By the time they reached the cave house, darkness had settled across the valley. Lantern light filled the main chamber, while a small fire crackled inside the stone fireplace. The familiar scent of pine smoke mixed with cool mountain air drifting through the entrance. The place no longer felt mysterious. It felt sacred, like a witness that had silently guarded memories for generations. Eleanor sat at the stone table where Ethan had first opened the hidden steel box. Ranger lay beside her chair. His eyes followed every movement as she carefully turned the envelope over in her hands. Finally, with a steady breath, she broke the seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age but remained remarkably intact. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's words flowed across the page exactly as he had written them decades earlier. Eleanor began reading aloud. The letter was not a defense. It was not an explanation. It was a confession of love. He wrote about watching her grow from a distance he never wanted. He described birthdays he could not attend and milestones he celebrated alone. He admitted his greatest regret was not disappearing. His greatest regret was allowing her to believe she had been abandoned. Tears rolled silently down Eleanor's face as she continued. Ethan looked away to give her privacy, but the emotion in her voice filled the cave. Then the letter revealed something unexpected. The witness wrote about the sheriff, not with anger, not with bitterness. Instead, he described a friend who became trapped between loyalty and fear. A man who made the wrong choice but spent the remainder of his life trying to protect what little truth remained. According to the letter, the sheriff secretly ensured the evidence survived. He guided Margaret. He preserved records. He even arranged for the false story surrounding the witness to slowly weaken over time. Redemption had arrived too late to repair the damage, but it had arrived nonetheless. Eleanor paused several times while reading. The cave remained silent except for the crackling fire and distant wind beyond the entrance. Then she reached the final page. There, beneath the closing words, her father had included one final instruction. He asked that the evidence not be used to punish anyone. The people responsible were long gone. Instead, he wanted the truth shared so future generations would remember what happened. Not as a story of corruption, not as a story of betrayal, as a story about the cost of fear and the importance of courage. Ethan felt the weight of those words settle across the room. For so long the mystery had seemed centered on hidden crimes. Yet the deeper truth was something far more human. People failed. People regretted. People tried to make amends. Eleanor carefully folded the letter and smiled through her tears. For the first time since meeting her, Ethan saw peace replace uncertainty. She finally knew who her father truly was. Ranger slowly rose and approached the fireplace. His ears lifted toward the stone wall where the first hidden compartment had been discovered. Ethan followed his gaze. There, illuminated by flickering firelight, he noticed something he had somehow missed before. Carved into the stone above the handprint symbol was a line of text almost invisible beneath years of dust. He stepped closer and brushed the surface clean. The words emerged one by one. Beneath this house rests the last room. The words remained visible long after Ethan stepped away from the wall. Beneath this house rests the last room. Firelight flickered across the carved letters while silence settled over the cave. Eleanor stood beside him, still holding her father's letter. Ranger remained near the fireplace, staring at the stone floor with the same unwavering focus that had guided every discovery since the day they arrived. Ethan had learned to trust that look. Whenever Ranger became this intent, something important was always waiting nearby. The next morning sunlight filtered into the cave house as they began searching. The inscription suggested the final secret was not hidden behind the walls. It was beneath them. Ethan examined every section of the stone floor. Most appeared solid and untouched. Hours passed without progress. Dust covered his hands. Tools lay scattered across the chamber. Yet Ranger never seemed discouraged. The German shepherd repeatedly returned to a specific spot near the center of the room. It was easy to overlook. A section of floor no different from the surrounding stone. Yet every time Ethan looked away, Ranger returned there. Finally, Ethan knelt beside him. The surface appeared smooth except for a narrow groove running along one edge. It was nearly invisible beneath decades of dirt. Ethan cleaned the area carefully. More grooves appeared. Then a pattern emerged. The floor was not one solid slab. It was a concealed hatch carved to blend perfectly with the surrounding stone. His pulse quickened. Together, Ethan and Eleanor worked to clear the remaining debris. Eventually, they uncovered an iron ring similar to the one hidden behind the wall compartment. Time had darkened the metal almost beyond recognition. Ethan gripped it firmly and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then the stone shifted. A deep grinding sound echoed through the cave. Dust drifted from above. Slowly, the concealed section lifted enough to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Cool air rose from below, carrying the scent of aged wood and stone. Ranger stood immediately. His ears lifted. Without hesitation, he started down the stairs. Ethan grabbed a lantern and followed. Eleanor came behind him. The staircase descended nearly 20 feet before opening into a hidden chamber unlike anything they expected. The room was surprisingly large. Wooden shelves lined the walls. Dozens of carefully organized boxes rested inside. Everything appeared preserved, protected, waiting. The witness had not created a hiding place. He had created an archive. Ethan moved slowly through the room. Documents filled one shelf. Photographs occupied another. Newspaper clippings, journals, maps, correspondence, and legal records filled the remaining space. Every piece of evidence gathered throughout the years had been stored here. Ranger wandered toward the far wall and sat beside a wooden cabinet standing alone beneath a lantern hook. Unlike the other storage containers, this cabinet carried a brass nameplate. Ethan brushed away the dust. The engraving became visible. For those who come after, his chest tightened. He carefully opened the cabinet doors. Inside rested several leather-bound books, family histories, personal journals, records of land ownership, detailed accounts of events that had shaped the entire region. Yet one object stood apart from the rest. A framed photograph placed at eye level. The image showed the witness, the sheriff, Margaret, and several local families standing together many years before everything changed. They were smiling, laughing, living ordinary lives. The sight was unexpectedly moving. Before fear, before secrets, before betrayal, Ethan realized something important then. History often remembered people at their worst moments. The witness had preserved evidence not to expose failures alone, but to preserve the full truth of who everyone had once been. Eleanor quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Ranger remained seated before the cabinet. Then Ethan noticed a folded document tucked behind the photograph. Unlike the others, it carried a county seal and a recent date compared to the surrounding materials. He opened it carefully. As he read the first page, disbelief crossed his face. The document identified a surviving legal trust established decades earlier. A trust created for one purpose only: to restore every stolen property to the descendants of the families who originally owned them. The hidden trust documents changed everything. Ethan read the pages twice to make certain he understood them correctly. The witness had anticipated that one day the truth would emerge. He had not merely preserved evidence. He had created a path toward restoration. Every document inside the underground archive supported the same purpose. Property records matched ownership histories. Survey maps connected parcels of land to families whose names had nearly disappeared from local memory. Legal statements explained how the trust would activate once the complete collection of evidence was discovered and verified. Ranger rested beside the cabinet while Eleanor carefully examined the records. Sunlight from the cave entrance filtered faintly down the staircase above, mixing with the warm glow of lantern light. The hidden room no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a promise finally reaching fulfillment. Over the following weeks, Ethan worked alongside attorneys, historians, and county officials. At first, many people were skeptical. The story sounded impossible. A forgotten witness, hidden archives, secret chambers beneath a cave house. Yet evidence has a quiet power. Every document supported the next. Every signature matched historical records. Every photograph connected people, places, and events. One by one, doubts disappeared. News spread throughout the region. Families who had never heard their grandparents speak about lost property suddenly discovered their names inside the records. Elderly residents began sharing stories passed down through generations. Pieces of local history that had nearly vanished returned to the surface. Eleanor remained at the center of it all. For the first time in her life, she could speak about her father without uncertainty. She no longer carried questions without answers. She carried truth. One afternoon, a gathering was held in the town square. The same community that had unknowingly repeated incomplete stories for decades now listened as historians presented verified findings from the archive. No one spoke with anger. No one sought revenge. The people responsible had been gone for many years. Instead, the atmosphere felt reflective, honest, healing. Ranger accompanied Ethan everywhere throughout the process. Children often approached to pet him. Older residents smiled when they learned how the German Shepherd had discovered the first clues. More than once, people joked that the entire mystery would have remained buried without him. Ethan always agreed. Deep down, he knew it was true. Every important discovery began with Ranger noticing something others overlooked. The hidden wall, the cemetery marker, the mountain cabin, the final room. The dog had guided them through every chapter of the journey. As autumn deepened, legal restoration of the trust moved forward. Several descendants received long overdue recognition connected to family land and historical records. More importantly, the witness's name was officially cleared. County archives corrected decades of misinformation. New historical displays documented the full story. Eleanor attended each event quietly, often carrying a copy of her father's final letter. One evening, she and Ethan returned to the cave house together. Golden leaves drifted across the valley. The mountains glowed beneath the setting sun. Ranger walked ahead along the familiar path before stopping near the entrance. The cave stood peaceful beneath the cliff face. No longer a hiding place. No longer a secret. Inside, the archive remained preserved exactly as it had been discovered. Ethan looked around the chamber and felt a sense of completion. Yet as they prepared to leave, Eleanor noticed something resting on the stone table near the fireplace. It had not been there before. A small wooden box, dust-free, carefully placed. Ethan frowned. He knew every corner of the cave house by now. The box was new. Ranger approached first. His ears lifted. His tail moved slowly. Eleanor opened the lid. Inside rested a single key attached to an old brass tag. Carved into the tag were 4 words that none of them had seen before. The journey is not over. The small brass key rested in Ethan's palm as evening settled across the valley. The words engraved on the tag lingered in his mind. The journey is not over. For a moment, he almost laughed. After everything they had uncovered, after every hidden room, every document, every secret preserved through generations, the idea seemed impossible. Yet nothing about the past few months had followed ordinary rules. Ranger sat beside the stone table, watching the key with quiet interest. Eleanor smiled softly and shook her head. My father always believed one truth could lead to another. The 3 of them searched the cave house one final time before darkness fully arrived. No new compartments appeared. No additional messages revealed themselves. Eventually, Ethan slipped the key into his jacket pocket. Whatever lock it belonged to would reveal itself when the time was right. Winter arrived soon after. Snow covered the mountains. The cave house stood against white hillsides and frozen pine forests like a monument preserved by time itself. Restoration work continued throughout the season. Historians cataloged the archive. Local families visited to learn about relatives whose stories had nearly vanished. School groups occasionally toured the property. What had once been a forgotten shelter hidden inside a mountain slowly became something else. A place where memory survived. A place where truth was welcomed home. Ranger became something of a local legend. Visitors often asked about the German shepherd who found the first clue. Children brought him treats. Elderly residents stopped to scratch behind his ears. Through it all, Ranger remained exactly the same. Loyal, watchful, humble, as though he never understood how many lives he had changed. One bright spring morning, nearly a year after Ethan first arrived, a letter appeared in the mailbox near the property entrance. There was no return address. Inside rested a single photograph. Ethan immediately recognized the building shown in the image. It was the stone structure from the old photograph Eleanor had discovered months earlier. The one where Margaret stood beside her father. On the back, someone had written a short message. Thank you for finishing what he started. Beneath the note appeared an address. Curious, Ethan drove there several days later with Ranger beside him. The location turned out to be a small historical society archive in another county. There he learned the final purpose of the brass key. It opened a display case that had remained locked for decades. Inside rested nothing valuable. No treasure. No hidden fortune. Only a collection of personal items belonging to the witness. His pocket watch. A family Bible. A few photographs. Letters from Eleanor as a child. Simple things. Human things. Yet among them sat one final note. Ethan unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was familiar by now. The witness wrote that history often remembers events, but forgets hearts. He hoped future generations would remember both. He hoped they would understand that courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing truth despite fear. Ethan stood quietly for a long time after reading those words. Later that evening, he returned to the cave house. The sun was setting beyond the mountains. Golden light filled the valley. Ranger climbed the hillside overlooking the property and sat facing the horizon. Ethan joined him. Below them, the cave house stood peaceful and strong beneath the cliff face. The secrets were gone. The questions were answered. The truth had found its way home. A gentle wind moved through the pines. Ranger leaned against Ethan's side. Neither needed to speak. Some journeys do not end with victory. They end with grace. And as the last light faded across the mountains, Ethan realized the cave house had never been waiting for evidence to be found. It had been waiting for someone willing to listen. And somehow, through loyalty, patience, and the guidance of a faithful German shepherd, the mountain had finally been heard.